When I was at before the break, I was noting something, and the scrap of paper I wrote what I was noting on has disappeared, Mr. President.
You were about to note
something. I was about to note something.
And it was on the other side of you.
It was, wasn't it? I wonder where I've noted it. I must have taken it back to the office and misplaced it. Or it's disappeared while I left things stuck here. Maybe it blew away. Mr. President, I will pick up a different point then and hope that it doesn't follow on too clangingly from where I left off before. I've spoken a reasonable amount about the fact that I feel the government's processes were flawed and that they've been shown up by subsequent proposals that have come forward, which, of course, would need to be fully developed and assessed under their own merits, but on the face of it have received a very warm reception and demonstrated a great deal of interest and certainly a great deal of what appears to be respectful process. I do note that it's interesting, in our briefing this morning, those proponents for that second Alternative 2.0 project mentioned writing to the Premier, and then the Premier wrote back to them to outline things that needed to be provided in more detail by the 5th of February by those proponents to be considered in a continuing way as a potential project. And I was interested to see in the Premier's letter back to them, which was provided to us, particular attention in the list of various things, particular attention drawn to environmental impact concerns, and particularly in relation to the handfish, and noting that there was a risk of extinction for that handfish, and therefore that would be something that the proponents would have to demonstrate that they had dealt with and that they had interacted appropriately with the federal government about. It's particularly ironic, Mr. President, to have the government point that sort of matter out to other proponents at this time when we're seeing right now the state government being incredibly rebuffing of concerns around Maugean skate and its extinction in Macquarie Harbour rather than Macquarie Point. Perhaps if the Maugean skate was at Macquarie Point and was going to be impacted by another proponent's proposal, the government may be giving it more precedence over other concerns. I do think it's very interesting to see also, and as others have noted here too, the particular concern that this whole process appears to be at the beck and call. We appear to be at the beck and call of the AFL. It appears that the AFL has been directing our state, if not bullying our state, certainly exerting all influence over the direction of the proposals around the stadium so far appears to have come from the AFL. And that's disturbing. I think it's disturbing for many Tasmanians. It's certainly something that's commented on to me, and I imagine to other members quite regularly, that this is a very unfortunate situation for our state and its people to feel that it's being blackmailed, essentially, by an entity such as the AFL, and that we're dancing to their tune. I do note, and again, connecting back to events of this week, the Premier seems to be very keen to fiercely stand up against the federal government in relation to the Maugean skate in Macquarie Harbour when it comes to the federal government potentially putting its foot down around arrangements there. We have a lot of very, very fierce words from the Premier this week around that, and yet there's no evidence at all that the Premier on behalf of the state has been able to stand up to the AFL when it was putting its foot down over matters to do with this proposal and the agreement around a team, which is very disappointing. Mr. President, others have spoken about the financial matters in relation to this project, and of course, if this project goes through a project of state significance, assessment, integrated assessment, financial matters will be fully looked into as part of that, and I acknowledge that. The information we have to date, though, is at best highly concerning. We know that there's a figure that the state government have put out there, which is the figure that will be apparently the Tasmanian taxpayers' investment in this via the government. And we know that there is absolutely no one who credibly believes that's still the figure that will be required to build a stadium. And that's highly concerning, because if the government is insisting still that that figure can deliver a stadium at Macquarie Point, essentially what that means is they'll have to cut their cloth to fit the figure. And that's disturbing because it's going to mean compromises on whatever that stadium may ultimately present as and be. There's absolutely no way that a number come up with a couple of years ago is now a credible figure for producing the stadium as described. I do also wonder, and perhaps we can get some clarification on this, in relation to this PoSS direction, sending the stadium into the PoSS process. It is very specifically just the stadium itself that is being sent into this process. So I'd like the leader, summing up, to confirm that we are, although what we have from Macquarie Point Development Corporation is in fact a precinct plan. The precinct plan was produced in order to satisfy federal government commitments of funding, but the precinct itself in total is not what we're sending into the PoSS process here, and I'd just like that confirmed by the leader. It's just the stadium component of the precinct plan. And so what I'd also like clarified, if that's the case, is when the integrated assessment occurs, which is going to cover each of those sort of aspects, economic, cultural, social, environmental, that assessment is only being done of the stadium in isolation. And whether in, say, making the economic assessment or making the social or cultural assessments, the other aspects that are laid out in the precinct plan would be my expectation, would not be brought into the assessment, because that's not what we're sending into the PoSS process. And I'd like that quite clearly clarified, because from what I would understand, having put forward the precinct plan in order to satisfy a requirement of the federal government to have a plan, we don't actually have any guarantees that the other elements beyond the oval stadium structure and its concourse, we don't have guarantees that those other elements will actually come about. Perhaps the leader can confirm if that's otherwise, to my understanding. But it's a plan. We know that plans have existed in this space before and were readily discarded. So I just want to be very, very clear here that what is being sent into the PoSS assessment process is the stadium and only the stadium, that the assessments will be made on the basis of the stadium and only the stadium, not the additional developments the plan lays out around it. And a comment on what guarantees, if any, there are that the other elements of that plan will even be delivered. I do note also on that same point that given that the only thing we are definitely trying to progress tangibly through this PoSS directive is the stadium element of the precinct, from the precinct plan, it's quite astonishing really to observe yet again its virtual visual absence from the plan. Everything else is very nicely pictured. Everything else is very visual and lovely. When we look at what's proposed for the precinct, we see all sorts of other structures presented for us clearly. But the thing that's absolutely a glaring opaque void is the actual potential visual representation of the stadium itself. And it does not go unnoted in any discussion on this topic how reluctant the government is to present anything remotely like a true and accurate representation of what this structure might look like in its context from various important sites and sight lines. There are all kinds of proposals put forward from the government with these very opaque and very modest-looking structures that others have taken issue with, and I haven't seen the government actually defend itself when, appropriately, when others have put forward what they believe to be more accurate visual representations and explain why those are not accurate. So it's disturbing, Mr President, that really the heart of this, the stadium, is the thing we're sending into this process. The stadium is the thing that's being assessed, not all the rest of the pretty pictures around it, but that's the thing that we actually don't have a very clear visual representation of at all. To return, I guess, just to sum up my position, I am concerned and remain highly concerned about what the process means to us that has been used for this proposal to be brought forward from its very first inception, where it was just mentioned as a thought bubble in a Premier's address, previous Premier's address, and then began to move through and become promoted by subsequently Premier Rockcliffe and wrapped up as part of a deal with the AFL, which was signed off very much again behind the scenes without much process or public visibility, let alone public consultation on it. It's highly disturbing that we have basically had foisted on us this outcome, and now we've reverse engineered a process to provide a rationale for it and information to send it into a planning process. The planning process that we're sending it into through this PoSS directive is only being used because the government downstairs lost its numbers on the floor and had to promise to use this in order to maintain confidence and supply on the floor. So we're here now with this proposed to go through a project of state significance process, a process which is lengthy, intensive, expensive, requires involvement from a range of stakeholders, including the Tasmanian community, and yet, as we are here contemplating sending the proposal into that process, we also have the potential suggestion that there's another better alternative proposal. And it's a mess, quite frankly, that's there, and this proposal, which is shaping up not very well alongside it, is still asking to be put through this PoSS process, which once we begin it, it'll be interesting to see how it does stack up if it goes through an integrated assessment. But and again, it would come back to this place. So I think we can all do the numbers and know the likelihood of today's vote result. But if and when it does come back as a result of going through an integrated assessment, we will certainly have an opportunity to give it full consideration then. And I presume we would also have an opportunity to know a great deal more about potential alternatives. My concern is that that's a very unfortunate waste of money. I presume the taxpayers are paying for it. I'd actually quite like the leader to provide some indication of the cost of this PoSS process to the taxpayer. Now, I understand the Planning Commission is undertaking it, and perhaps we can put aside the costs of the Planning Commission's time and energy, although it'd be interesting to know how much will be spent on this. But even beyond that, I presume that there will also be payments have to be made for particular sorts of assessments or expert studies and all that sort of thing. It would be very good to know how much in total has been and will need to be spent on this in order to get it through, potentially through a PoSS process. Certainly I'm assuming that whatever that cost is, it's in addition to the $715 million that is allocated there for a stadium. Would be good to understand that. So, Mr. President, I think fundamentally, beyond any of those other comments that I make, on my personal view is that this structure and this proposal for this structure is fundamentally inappropriate for the site that it's proposed to be on. Fundamentally. Now, it's not my judgment to make that yea or nay. It'd certainly be interesting to see how it goes through an integrated assessment. But I absolutely cannot see that structure, stadium structure in that site at Mac Point isn't going to be utterly unsuitable. Not just for the cenotaph and the matters to do with cenotaph sightlines and sense of place, but also for the Sullivan's Cove area and also for the sense of Hobart as a place, the character of Hobart. So I'm fundamentally have an issue with this being the wrong place for this structure, for this particular structure. Having said that, Mr. President, sharing that opinion does not make me anti-everything. And I don't appreciate name-calling in that sort of way. So the times across the public discussion on this matter in which name-calling has been entered into are very, I think, childish and inappropriate. I am absolutely happy to consider projects and proposals that have been undertaken through processes that are appropriate and respectful and involve the community and put public interest at the forefront, and particularly aren't dictated by corporate interests from interstate. And I'll always consider those on an absolute good faith basis. So do I believe that this project should be considered in the PoSS process? No, I don't. I think we should be looking for better options that deliver better public interest. I absolutely would like to see us find an option taking us forward that would allow for a team for our state and would meet requirements that need to be met for that. I'm open to that. I do not believe that this proposal and this process for this proposal is the way forward. So I'll be voting against this matter.